I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, Professor Todd Foley. Todd is the adjunct assistant professor. He teaches at NYU. He's a translator of the recent translation out from Cornell University Press, I Love Bill, and Other Stories. Todd, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast today.
No, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You translated I Love Bill, which is a collection of, I think, 5 stories, I guess 2 novellas and 3 stories. I don't know. Am I getting that characterization right?
3 short stories. I guess we'd consider I Love Bill and The Troop, the 中篇小说, the novella form. And then the other 3 are just the short stories.
It's a little hard to talk about the difference between a short story and a novella in Chinese because I feel like in Chinese the boundaries are much less important between those, whereas in English we make a big deal if it's a short story, a novella, or a novel. Those are very different things. But in Chinese, I don't know. Do you feel the same way?
Well, I think this was part of a problem of publication for a lot of Wang Anyi's greatest works, is that they're written in novella form, which isn't really a form in English. I mean, it is, but it's not one that gets published a lot, certainly not as standalone books. And I picked up I Love Bill, published in its own little book, readily available at a bookstore in China. Her novella, which Andrea Lingenfelter translated as The Sanctimonious Cobbler, 骄傲的皮匠, also available in a nice little tiny novella form. So that's a thing that happens, and you can't really find a publisher for just a standalone novella usually.
In English, it's almost like a problem of the market.
It was an effort to get some of her novellas and shorter work out there when novels are usually easier to market. The novella, I think, is a really important form for a lot of contemporary Chinese writers that disappears in their availability in English translation just because of the publishing situation.
It's funny. So in the translator's preface, you talk about how difficult it is to translate things, and you discuss the problems of language, but I don't feel like anyone ever discusses the problem of like market and the way different genres translate into other languages and other cultures. But that is also something that I think is quite challenging for Chinese writers who want to get more airtime in the English language market and in other non-Chinese language markets.
Oh, definitely. And no one wants to publish translations anyway. There's no market for them in English. So already it's difficult.
Yeah. Just so tell me a little bit about how this project came together. Wang Anyi was hosted by NYU there in 2016. Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, she was visiting NYU for the semester. She was a writer in residence. And so every other week we had a scheduled workshop with her where she would assign us a selection of works that she had chosen herself that she wanted to talk about. And we'd read them beforehand and go and have sort of a free-flowing discussion with her for about 2.5 hours. And so after the end of the semester, I had sort of been talking about a translation project of some of these selections. But really, it was all from my interest in I Love Bill to begin with, which was always one of my favorite stories of hers. And this is probably part of the novella problem. So I asked, has anyone asked to translate this? No, it's been written in the mid-90s, right? And just sitting there waiting to be translated. So I thought, well, that's one that I really want to get into English. I mean, for the most utilitarian purposes, really, being able to use it in class, because it's a really great text to use in class and a great example of something that really captures a certain essence of the mid-90s, early 90s, mid-90s in China.
So I Love Bill is a story that takes up about 100 pages in this, I guess it's a little bit more than 200 pages of actual text after you get through the prefaces. I think it really dominates this collection in a good way. What drew you to I Love Bill? Why did you think that work particularly needed to be translated?
Well, this is probably going to sound sycophantic, but I read my advisor, Zhang Shudong's analysis of it in his book on post-socialism, like my first year in grad school or whatever. But I loved it. And so I So I read the book because of that, because I thought it just dealt with a lot of really interesting ideas and tensions. And so I read it and thought it was great. And in teaching whatever introductory classes of Chinese literature, I always sort of found myself drawing upon that, even though I couldn't assign it because I had to assign stuff that was available in English translation for students who can't read Chinese. So I guess it all sort of started from there. But if I wanted to translate I Love Bill, I had to translate some other stuff too, right? Because there's no way to just publish I Love Bill. So it grew from there.
First off, could you just explain the story itself? Like, could you walk the listener through what actually happens? Even when I was reading it, because of the sort of the way it's broken up into almost two halves, not in terms of length, but at least in terms of like the narration. Those two halves are only barely connected, and Wang Anyi, I think playfully doesn't explain the connection, though it's clear what happens. She leaves these two things dangling, and one of the things that I found most striking is she doesn't draw an explicit connection between the two parts of the novella. I wasn't sure exactly what she was trying to do, and I actually was wondering for my own edification, help me out, explain this novella.
Yeah, it's a story that takes like abrupt and shocking twist, doesn't it? Which obviously is foreshadowed in the very opening when she's in the prison van. But so basically, it centers on Asan, a young art student in Shanghai, who really, how do we say, she has a dream of participating in this cosmopolitan imaginary that she can access seemingly through two avenues, through art and through her relationships with these Western guys, Bill being the first one. And so she ends up having this first mini successful exhibition that people are interested in, where she meets Bill. And so she progresses her relationship with Bill. She progresses in her success in the art world to varying degrees. But neither of them end up working out, right? She ends up dropping out of art school. Bill ends up getting reassigned somewhere else and leaving and never having contact with her again. So she keeps seeking out relations with these foreign men, and she has a subsequent relationship with this French guy named Martin, who runs an art gallery in France. But he's only there temporarily and he leaves. And she has progressive success in the art world, but then that doesn't really end up working out either. And working out in the context of early 90s Shanghai would be getting a foreign patron, getting a foreign visa, which she mentioned several times. Anyone who passes through the sitting room of this author figure is said to be able to obtain a foreign visa. But none of that ever really works out for Asan. And so she starts hanging out in the lobbies of five-star hotels in the international district in Shanghai. And until one night, she's hanging out with this group of young, dumb British guys. And she's flirting with them, enjoying herself, but not taking them very seriously. They get stereotypically drunk, and a misunderstanding ensues. They think she wants to take one of them to bed, which is not really her intention, but the police are called, and the next thing we know, she's in a labor reform camp. And then the end of the novella chronicles her struggles in this labor reform camp, where she's making sweaters, sewing tags into sweaters, and dealing with the complicated relationships amongst these women prisoners who are all there for prostitution. She claims she never accepted any money, so she gets this nickname of freebie. And so she now finds herself in this like new social hierarchy of prostitutes from Shanghai who are in prison. And it ends with her forced escape for her own self-preservation.
Much of this novel is about Asan, and she is just floating through her life. I guess she says she has a goal, but she seems very goalless. She's sleeping with these men. I do not see her as engaging in prostitution because she is seeking something out for herself in those men. She's using them quite a bit, and she makes that quite clear. These are just conquest for her. And I think conquest is the right word. There's that section with the Japanese businessman who she seems to have a sexual relationship with only to embarrass him. Like she strings him on, and it's just a short paragraph, but it demonstrates the politics that are involved in this. She makes him so that he feels like he can't do without her, and then all of a sudden she leaves him for a Canadian, and just as a way to hurt him. And she refers to it as the war of resistance against Japan. That's how she talks about their relationship.
And we could make a fun chart of these guys she's with. At the bottom would be the guy who she thinks is Chinese American or an overseas Chinese, but then discovers he's actually from Shanghai, just like she is. And they immediately part ways. They have no interest whatsoever in each other once it's revealed that they're both just from Shanghai. And then above him, we'd have this Japanese guy who presents some international allure, but who's also not really what she's after. And then obviously at the top we'd have Bill, right, who she maintains this strange love in whatever sense that's meant for throughout the novella. But I think a real thing that sets this apart from most of Wang Anyi's other works, because I think it's really different, especially if you read The Troop, which bears very little resemblance to I Love Bill. So I thought it worked as a good sort of complement to this. But Wang Anyi said in our discussion, she started from a concept with this story, which she almost never does. She's a hardcore realist writer. She writes from life. She writes from characters. But she wanted to write about a concept here, which was East and West. And so the basis for her materials in this were these series of interviews she conducted at the Baimaoling labor reform camp, which is where the end of the novella is set, this prison for women from Shanghai, which is out in Anhui province or wherever.
So I didn't realize that was a real place. Okay.
It's definitely based on a real place. And so I think that gives it a really different character, and it really affects my reading of it too. But at the same time, I don't think I needed to hear her say that to feel this more sort of conceptual concern that she's got. And I think Bill is a really interesting key here. First of all, she uses no direct dialogue, which is really interesting. It's
pretty much in any of her works, she doesn't use direct dialogue, right?
She did in her early 80s stuff, but she gets away from that. She feels like she doesn't it's not her strength. She said in our talks, but I think it's really important in something like this, because what we're getting, it's a work of realism, obviously, but we're getting this ambiguous narrative perspective, which isn't first person from Asan, but it's a third person narrator who is writing from Asan's perspective, but also is relating things that Bill says and their conversations already translated, already mediated somehow through Asan's perspective. So Bill ends up being this concept. If we take it as like an accurate realist portrayal of an American diplomat, it doesn't really work in any way, does it? He grew up around the world as the son of a diplomat, but then later on it's mentioned that he grew up in the cornfields of the Midwest, and then he's singing his college's fight song as they walk down the street like it's the 1950s or something, and it doesn't really matter.
All of the male characters, all of the men she conquers, seem to be stereotypes. There was Martin, who has, like, she talks about him in almost this racialized genetic way. He's this French guy who comes from this small town where everybody has lived. It's all the same genetically. It's the same. I thought that was interesting that she's reaching back. She's suggesting that France is reaching back into this antiquity. It's a sort of stereotypical understanding of France, but also it had echoes to me of how I've heard Chinese folks sometimes talk about China, as if there's this projection of China's long history onto France. So Martin is completely I think is quite different. He's quite contrasting in terms of Bill. And those are the two men that she never forgets. And those are also the two men, if I believe, I think I'm correct in saying those are the only two paramours that we know their names. Is that right? Because there's the Belgian who she has a...
That's right. I would consider the Belgian in third place, but we don't get the Belgian's name.
So he's not quite as valuable in terms of her how she thinks about him.
Right. But the one thing he does offer is this sense of home.
There's this real domesticity.
Exactly. An element of concrete, dependable daily life that she sees with him that she hasn't seen with the other two.
Until his girlfriend comes to China, and then she's out.
Oh, right. Of course. Yeah, she has no hope of actually occupying that place of daily life with this Belgian. And would she even really like the Belgian in the long term? Probably not. But hard to say. But yeah, this thing about the long bloodline that he comes from in France, I sort of see it as part of the concept. It's not necessarily that it's like some racialized understanding of France or Western Europe, but I think it foregrounds the ontological differences that they have. And that's what she really comes up against with Martin as opposed to Bill. Bill is the initial concept, cosmopolitan modernity, the West, freedom. They go down the streets pretending they're in any city in the world. Where are we? I'm Zorro. You're Carmen. Is this Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Rome, Paris, London, the Vatican? And that's really her happiest moment in the novel. And I think it's because it's the only time that Bill allows her to really fully participate in this cosmopolitan imaginary that she's yearning for. Aside from that, she's perpetually dissatisfied with Bill because he's making her Chinese, right? He's constantly referring to the fact that she's different, that she's Chinese. And he always says, you're the most special, you're the most unique, but never you're the most beautiful, never a universal appraisal of value for her. It's always something characterized by difference. And that's what bothers her. And that's why she loves pretending she's in these different cities. But for Martin, we start to get to the heart of the matter, right? Martin's an art collector himself. And so he's evaluating her paintings. He's sitting there contemplating them and then gives his evaluation, which is not really all that positive. But it shows Asan what the root of the problem is. God. I mean, it's not necessarily God, but it's a totally different conception of being in existence, really, that they're operating from. And she sees then that they'll never really meet in the middle. And that's why Martin deals such a devastating blow to her art production, I think. Before, she painted from happiness, right? That's what she says in the first pages. She's not painting in dialogue with history. She's not painting like the slightly older generation is doing, that she's exhibiting with, dealing with the scars of the Cultural Revolution or any of this stuff. She's just painting from happiness, a universal seeming expression of art. And that's what she's trying to do the whole way through until she comes up to Martin and she sees, oh, you can't really do that. We're at the base, we're operating from different foundations. And that's why her whole house comes crashing down. She puts it in this metaphor. Martin, I built a house and you destroyed it and you're not taking responsibility now. And she can't paint after that for, I think, for the rest of the time because she doesn't know how.
We talked a lot about her in terms of sex, but much of the novella is also concerned with her in terms of painting. And it's interesting because you mentioned that Bill wants her to be more Chinese. That's his expectation. If she is investing in this relationship with Bill because she wants this cosmopolitan imaginary that you talk about, this sense that she can go anywhere and be a part of the modern world and jet off to wherever she wants to go. Bill is trying to contain her in this concept of Chineseness, but he's not the only one trying to do it. As an artist, she is expected to paint stuff that is Chinese, that evokes a sense of Chinese identity, right?
Of course, the Western artists can do real, purportedly universal modern art. She's not allowed to do that. She has to do something Chinese, as the art critics tell her. What about this could be anywhere in the world? What about it makes it from China? She's not allowed to participate in the highest levels of what hierarchically are the highest levels of artistic production. She's not allowed to make something that's seen in universal terms on its own terms, in some sort of ideal of art for art's sake. She's not admitted entry into that sort of echelon. She's constantly being made to be Chinese. And this is so obvious in Bill's character. He's such a buffoon, right? I love I love the scene where they go to that little village together. She's clearly experiencing new feelings and stuff, and it's exciting there with Bill. And Bill starts reciting Peach Blossom Spring in Chinese. I mean, it's so hilariously painful. And and we're told she doesn't listen to him. She's not listening to his recitation of Peach Blossom Spring. She's thinking about other things. And it tells us clearly for Bill, it's a China thing. But for Asan, it's a people thing.
It seems like Asan's relationship with these men is, maybe it's possible to read this as a diplomatic metaphor, that this is she's writing in the mid-90s. You have this Chinese folks are looking to the West and trying to find something. They're looking for some sort of cultural capital, and in various ways these things seem to fail, particularly in the post-89 period, where there is this question of legitimacy for China and Chineseness, and Chinese people are struggling to understand their place in the world. Is it fair to read Asan's relationship with these men as on a national level, or is that, do you think that's reading too much into it?
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows what Wang Anyi thinks or would say.
I wasn't sure if she revealed her secret sauce in these bi-weekly discussions that y'all did.
Well, she might have. We recorded them and transcribed them, and I translated them. This journal, Frontiers of Literary Studies, but I can't remember. But but the secrets might be in there. But I think more than a national thing, it's a East-West thing.
Okay.
And that's why we have this basket of American, British, French, Belgian.
They almost really don't have identities, these male figures, which is fascinating. They're faceless representatives.
And what are they representatives of? In my reading, it would be this purportedly universal modernity that is actually hierarchical and not open to everyone universally.
In the same way that the women in the prison it's hierarchical. Like there's a mirror image in terms of hierarchy that I thought was fascinating.
Oh yeah, definitely. And Yang Chunmian, her name indicates she's probably Sube person who's looked down on in Shanghai.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about Sube and the relationship in both I Love Bill and some of the other stories. Wang Anyi, correct me if I'm wrong, is a writer. She's born in Nanjing in Jiangsu, but she mostly grows up in Shanghai. And in Shanghai, Subeiren have a bad reputation. So Subei, for those listeners who don't know, it's in the northern part of Jiangsu province, and it has the reputation in Shanghai of being the redneckiest of places. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, and she was also in a Wengongtuan, a cultural workers troupe around Xuzhou, which is the setting of the story.
The troupe.
The troupe.
Right.
So she has a lot of feelings about Xuzhou and Subei.
And Girls Trip also was involved, them going towards Subei. Emily Honig has written a book called Creating Chinese Ethnicity. I think it was written actually back in the early 90s that talks about this Subei thing. That's my understanding of Subei and its relationship to Shanghai. What is going on with Subei in these stories?
Yeah, my only knowledge of it is from Wang Anyi.
Okay.
And her stories. But I think the troupe maybe puts it best in her most complete articulation of the particular position that it occupies. It's sort of the rural backwards antithesis to Shanghai, but so proximate right there. And Xuzhou becomes sort of this halfway house, or less than a halfway house, between this rural, northern, less desirable countryside, and ultra-modern Shanghai, which doesn't even really surface in the troupe. The biggest metropolitan center we get to there is Nanjing, I think. But it provides this continually productive dialogue with things like tradition and modernity, country, city, what is modernity, what value systems are we operating by today, what are the different competing value systems that exist in different places in different ways. It offers a lot of productive ground for discussing those things.
We've talked a lot about dichotomies, East West with I Love Bill, the Suzhou versus Shanghai. You have this country versus city, traditional. Would it be fair to say traditional, like the stereotypically older, more oriented towards tradition versus the cosmopolitan offerings available in Shanghai? Divide, the dichotomies, are those an important part of her works overall?
Yeah. Maybe putting it in that divide is sort of oversimplifying things. Maybe it's doing Wang Anyi a little wrong. Because in something like Girls' Trip or The Troupe, Shanghai doesn't actually appear. At the end of the Girls' Trip, they get on the train to Shanghai, or maybe they just arrive in Shanghai and disappear in the crowd. But it's just a little blink. It's just a glimmer. And so I think that's an important part as well. It's not like they're set in some sort of ham-handed contrast in her works, because she doesn't even include them in the same space usually, which is genius. It's one is left there as an implication.
As we get towards the end of this interview, I wanted to ask, so Yuhua, Moyan, Jia Pinghua, I would say Wang Anyi is up there in terms of the best writers coming out of the contemporary scene in China. But I would also say she's probably the one who gets the least coverage. Maybe I think that of the like top tier writers, I think she tends to get less press, less publicity. I guess two questions. Why do you think that is? And for my listeners, can you make the case that actually you really ought to be reading her?
Oh, that's a tough question. She makes so many brilliant, subtle references to something that colors our whole understanding and enriches our whole understanding of a work, that if you're just, interested in reading something from China, I'll pick up something from Wang Anyi, you'll miss it probably, because it requires some sort of, I don't know, tempering of
There's a line in Italian, like to translate is to betray. The word translation and traitor is the same thing.
I mean, it's true for all of them. But someone like Mo Yan or Yu Hua, they write really fast-moving, rollicking plots, and you can get engaged with those and read them and enjoy them. Doesn't matter if anything about China or not.
And the language itself is less important. Like the prose is less important when you have that fast-paced plot.
But in Wang Anyi, the genius comes in these teensy little tidbits. Like there are a million of them, but just to some examples that immediately come to mind. Asan can't pay in her own money in I Love Bill in the coffee shop because she's at a place that only accepts foreign exchange certificates, because foreigners had to use a different currency in China at that time. Or in A Girls' Trip, the character's name, Fan Tian. It's explained in the story, but is the real allegorical import apparent if you don't have some like intricate knowledge of the early reforms in the post-Mao years? The life of this young woman, Fan Tian, coincides with the first implementation of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, which is how she gets this name. And so in that light, it becomes some social commentary on all the years since the end of the Mao period. And that's not immediately apparent because Wang Anyi is a good writer, and she's not going to, it wouldn't be a good work if she made it more obvious, right?
It would be so apparent to someone reading it in Chinese that she has to be subtle about it, right?
Yeah. And in the troupe, I was just thinking about this one. There's this scene where their whatever party branch secretary leader, whoever it is, announces to the troupe the report of the counter-revolutionary protests at Tiananmen in 1976 on Qingming Festival after Zhou Enlai's death. And their response is not really much of anything in the troop. The secretary who's reporting the news, we're told, seems uneasy, seems a little off kilter. And the troop members don't really seem to care that much. They start joking over the loudspeakers unrelatedly. And our narrative voice tells us it's not that we didn't care, it's just that history was so far away from us and we were so far removed there in our little Xuzhou Wengongtuan. But then the next year, at the anniversary of Zhou Enlai's death, the 1-year anniversary, which of course is after Mao's died, after the fall of the Gang of Four, after the Cultural Revolution has ended, that's when they all feel really somber and sad. And the whole troop is overtaken by this mood, this feeling that's related to the national state of affairs. And that's part of, I think, the real brilliance of this, because they're a cultural workers troop, right? They're supposed to be promoting the official ideology and their activities in the troop, right? They are the agents of revolution. How could you say history is so far away from us in that description when they are history? They're the agents of history. They're the agents of revolution. And yet, look at the reality of the depiction. It actually seemed so far away from them that something like Zhou Enlai's death was inconsequential, didn't affect them at all. Not until that period ends and is over do they start to feel some coincidence of their own experience and their own feelings with these national events. And so it's like this subtle subversion of a more like orthodox ideological narrative. And it's stuff like that I think I didn't recognize that the first or second or third time I read it. I didn't think about it. But it's these subtle things that aren't going to immediately make an impact when you're reading them out of context in English. I don't know. That's my perspective on it.
The last question I have for you is, so Wang Anyi is this, I'd say she's very closely associated with Shanghai. She was the head of the Shanghai Writers Association. A lot of her writing is concerned with that. Do you see that coming out of this collection? I mean, I Love Bill to me didn't strike me as particularly Shanghaiese in some ways, but in other ways it had the feeling of Shanghai, where there's sort of, in the way that Beijingers look down on Shanghai as this place where everything's bought and sold and it's a bunch of foreigners, it definitely had those kinds of stereotypical elements of Shanghai. But in other ways it didn't feel that Shanghaiese to me at all. Like, the descriptions weren't, for me, particularly evocative of Shanghai. And I haven't spent that much time in Shanghai, so maybe I'm just out of the loop there. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of see I Love Bill as Shanghai itself, as this sort of complicated aspirational position that's got a lot of balls that's juggling in the air. And I guess, I don't know, I did my first study abroad in China, in Shanghai in like 2003. So for me, the descriptions, I think they're really evocative, like the lights across the river in Pudong, and the period of time when they're building all those giant skyscrapers, and you could go to the Jinmao Tower or whatever, but it was just a construction zone around that the taxi had to take you through to get there. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know. For me, it is. But then we also spend a lot of time not in Shanghai, right? We spend a lot of time in the village where she runs the apartment in the south. We spend a lot of time at the labor reform camp. But that's also a mini Shanghai. And it's all women from Shanghai, representatives of Shanghai in a really particular way, who are all out here in the middle of nowhere in Anhui province.
I'll put up a link on the website. If someone listening to this wants to buy it, I'd highly encourage you to go check it out if you're interested in learning about one of contemporary China's most famous, most interesting writers. This is a great place to start. Todd, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.